Good evening and welcome to the show. The name of the show is Comments with Dr. James Haney, and the topic tonight is the Emancipation Proclamation. And my first guest is Dr. RMitchell, Professor of History at Fisk University and the Assistant to the President at Fisk University. And let me welcome you as our first guest to our show tonight, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be asked.
Dr. Mitchell, we've talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, and what we'd like to do tonight is to make that proclamation have some reality in 1989. That is to talk about the impact that that whole movement had upon race relations today and indeed race relations in the future. And I'd like to do that by having you to, first of all, give us an overview of the institution of slavery, because after all, it was out of the institution of slavery that the Emancipation Proclamation will come.
That's very right, correct. 1619, the first blacks, Africans, arrived in the New World, quite by accident. They arrived on a Dutch man of war, a Dutch warship, cargo ship. The cargo was actually headed to New York, but the ship owner was lost, or the captain got a bit off course, and he landed in Virginia. He needed additional cargo and supplies to complete his voyage, so he decided to follow practice of selling approximately 24 blacks who were in his cargo. They were slaves, and they were sold as slaves.
And so this is 1619.
1619. There's actually some dispute now about the origin of those blacks. We know they're from the west coast of Africa. Some say they were sold into slavery by Arab traders, but probably more appropriately, they were sold into slavery by blacks in Africa, because it was the case in Africa that when two different units, tribes were at war, those who were defeated became the slaves.
Now, how long did slavery last in North America, Dr. Mitchell?
Slavery lasted in North America until the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're talking about from the 1600s until the 1860s in Lincoln's Proclamation. But slavery went through several very different changes in North America, and I think that's what we're speaking about. Those first 24 actually became free. They were the same type of servants as, say, white indentured servants who were brought over from Ireland or from England, poor classes. And there was really no color tied to the slave population. You were a slave for a very definite amount of time, and then once you were free. If you were an indentured servant, when you paid off your indentured, you were free. Historical record is very correct in Virginia. Those 24 became free. However, the other blacks who followed them into slavery were not quite as lucky. Freedom did not ensue. Eventually, because Virginia moved to a system of large plantations for agricultural purposes. And please remember that in America, in the South, where slavery had its most success, it was a part of an economic enterprise. The South needed large amounts of captive labor to carry on the plantation system. The American Indian had been tried, but the American Indian was not easily enslavable. Many Indians would commit suicide in slavery. Once they escaped to the back country, you couldn't follow them back there to chase your slave. And additionally, Indian male had not had a tradition of being an agriculturalist. They were warriors, they were hunters, they were not agriculturalists.
And so blacks are now finally made slaves, and of course that's written into the laws of all of the colonies and etc.
Eventually it becomes a law, and in the South especially, slavery and color and black color become synonymous.
Okay, so by 1862-63, we're in a situation where emancipation is about to come about. Now, Dr. Mitchell, what we'd like to do is to select 7 or 8 slides.
All right.
And to look at those slides and have you to make some comments about the institution of slavery as related to those slides. The first has to do with a plantation that was located on the Mississippi River. Now, what can you say about white slaveholding in the South?
Well, of course, there were several large plantations. Actually, sort of a misunderstood picture is not all of the South was plantation holding, and not everyone in the South owned slaves. In 1860, approximately 3,000 families in the South, only 3,000 families owned more than 100 slaves. This is a number smaller than the French nobility at the time of the French Revolution. Now, some more, say, around 5,000 to 7,000 may have owned 5 to 7 slaves.
But for the most part, slaveholding was very limited throughout
It
the
was very
southern parts
limited
of the
to
United
the
States.
upper class, the planter class.
Not all folks were involved in holding slaves.
No.
Now, what about we've got another one of the slave family here. What about this family?
All right, this is the extended slave family. I'm sure that's a father and mother and some children and some aunts and uncles. What's interesting about that, though, at any time that family could be broken up at the wish of the master. The master could sell off any of the children, as well as the mother and the father, any of the members. So there's a great precarious nature and a very uncertain nature of blacks and the black family during slavery.
Very good. We've got another one of the cotton scene here. I think it deals primarily with the economic basis for the institution of slavery.
That's the scene that makes economically the South work. Slaves are in field, the slaves that work in the cotton field, cotton was king. The Southern economy was built on cotton, even to its detriment, as the South overproduced cotton, which kept the poor white farmer without any slaves really poorer. The slave masters worked those slaves harder and harder to try to make up the surplus in money. And many of the slaves found themselves in the cotton fields. Those are the field hands. There were another class of slaves known as the house servants who may have worked in the house. Many times the masters with black women fathered many of the very fair-skinned who were house servants.
Okay, well, this next one has to do with children at work in slavery.
Slavery in the South was an economic activity, and just about everyone who was old enough to eat was considered old enough to work.
Slave markets.
Slave markets.
This is the next slide.
All right. All right, and that's the process of slaves being brought up, probably down at port, and being sold. At its height, a young black slave in good health, good worker, in excess of $3,000.
Very good. Slave coffles.
All right, slave coffles, that's the way after slaves were captured. When they were captured in Africa, Mother Africa, they were moved in those chains and coffles. They were chained and bound together. They were kept in those chains aboard ships and often packed in with very little room. But the average slave after capture could look forward to being chained for anywhere from 6 months to a year.
A system of punishment.
System of punishment, that was to really season the slave. And intimidation, punishment, and brutality were important elements in keeping a growing slave population held by a smaller master class.
And finally, the Nat Turner Insurrection.
Nat Turner's insurrection was a realization by some blacks, Nat Turner in this case, that the only way to gain freedom was to get up and fight for it yourself.
And of course that occurred in 1832, and there were some 60 whites killed in that slave insurrection. Dr. Mitchell, let me thank you for giving us that information, and we'll be back with you following this commercial break.